If you look at the Caspian Sea, for example, it is tradition regards it as the Sea of Kashyapa. And Kashyapa is both a rishi and a Buddha, much earlier than the historic Buddha. Hebrew, the word angel did not exist. It came, in fact, from Sanskrit. It came from the name of some of the rishis, in particular Angirasas. So that became Angelos, Angel. Quite a few more talks are coming. So I will make it very brief and succinct, because I think before such scholars to try to go into details on some of the Vedic knowledge would be a bit like not bringing coal to Newcastle, but bringing Gangajal to Kashi. So what I will do is project some perspectives from current international data and discoveries, which go a long way towards legitimating what has long been suspected about Indian history. And previous speakers have discussed some aspects of the chronology and of the overall, I would say, situation of the Indian past, which, as we know, has been grossly, I would say, manipulated because of a particular mindset from the dominant Western intellectual tradition, which right from the 16th, 17th century onwards in the West, but then again in the whole world, has tried to reinterpret the Indian past in the light of what was considered revealed truth. And the revealed truth, which was Judeo-Christian truth, has been replaced in the last 150 years by the so-called scientific awareness of history and the scientific method. But then again, there is a lot to be said about the scientific method. How scientific is it, and how much is it dictated by certain prejudices? Now, that will take me to, in fact, for example, commenting on what was said by Sri Vedvirarya about the presence of Buddhism in Central Asia before so-called Zoroastrianism or Mazdaism. And in this regard, I have always noticed that the reference, in particular in Mahayana Buddhism, to innumerable Buddhas coming before the historic Gautama Buddha indicates that there was a long-standing tradition in the Himalayas, in Central Asia, of what eventually came to be known as Buddhism, which therefore cannot be said in any event to begin in the 6th century BCE. And that in itself is, I think, a powerful support. I mean, if you look at the Caspian Sea, for example, it is tradition regards it as the Sea of Kashyapa. And Kashyapa is both a rishi and a Buddha, much earlier than the historic Buddha. So the tradition of incarnations into Buddhas certainly goes back a very long way. But anyway, this is just a detail. Now, what I'll go into is talking about the context of history in the because of Satya Yuga is the theme that we have been imparted to consider in this session. It's very interesting that Satya Yuga is part of a very widespread tradition of a so-called golden age. And you find it in so many different cultures, not only in Eurasia, but also in the pre-Columbian Americas. And in the case of Satya Yuga or Krita Yuga, the age of plenitude or accomplishment, you have very similar references to it. The ancient Latins, before they were called Romans, and before they were called Latins, Etruscans, were referring to the age of Saturn, which in fact is Sat Uranos and Satya. You recognize the same root. And it is supposed to have ended when Saturn was driven underground by the rebellion of his three sons, especially of the younger of the three, Jupiter. Now, this was somehow melded with the Greek mythology, which had a similar tradition of Zeus fighting his father and essentially taking over the throne. Now, this tells you that the tradition of Satya Yuga expands much, much beyond India. And you find very similar characteristics in the descriptions that are given of it. It's always seen as the age of innocence, of purity, of truth, where people didn't need to work, didn't need to wage war, and did not need to essentially grow food or hunt, because everything was provided plentifully by nature, and they live in a state of perfect communion with nature. As we all know, in the Vedic symbology, the Dharma bull had its 4 legs. Therefore, it didn't need any support. It was in its integrity. And furthermore, we find that in the so-called apocalyptic and messianic traditions which surface in the Middle East, right from about 3-4 centuries before the beginning of the Christian era, and which is incarnated in certain traditions like the Essenes, and there are a few others, then you find that there is always a return to this golden age, which is seen as due to begin again, and which therefore reminds us that many ancient civilizations shared the tradition of yugas, of successive eras. That, of course, was replaced by Christianity, which adopted a linear vision of history, saying that on the footsteps of Judaism, there was a beginning and there would be an end, and the end would be some sort of final accomplishment. And it didn't really look beyond that, you know. So the question is, when was the beginning and when was the end? And the Jewish, you might say, it's not by any means early Judaism. In fact, Judaism, as we know it, is a fairly late religion. But it finally came to a date which you find in certain scriptures connected to the Talmud. It dated the creation of the world to 4004, more or less. There are some diverse dates, but 4004 before what the Christians called year 1 AD. So, by the way, there is no year 0 in Christianity. It starts with 1. You know, as they say, it's like a child who is born at 1 year of age. But the fact is that 4004 BCE is seen as a fairly common Judeo-Christian date for the beginning of the world, the 7 days, or rather the 6 days that created the world. By the way, the 6 days are somewhat reminiscent of the original 6 Rishi Kulas, which became 7. So you can see that there is certainly a commonality in so many different things. And Jesus, the historic Jesus, insofar as we know of him, it was very much a prophet and an apostle of the coming of the Golden Age. In fact, the whole of Christianity was intended to welcome the Golden Age and prepare people for it. And it even talked about, if you look at some of the parables given by Jesus, he said that you should live like the lilies in the field, because they do not grow, they do not labor, and yet everything comes to them. So he was clearly alluding to the Golden Age and to the fact that the Golden Age would come, and those who were ready would be accepted in it, and those who weren't and who had gone against the principles, against the precepts, would be essentially going somewhere else, which was not a very good place, which was Jews called, they gave it various names, but the Sheol, you know, the sort of underground realms. Now, if you think of the underground as opposed to the heavens, you see that very clearly, very early in the Vedic texts, particularly in the Puranas, you have the opposition between the upper heavens, you know, Bhu, Bhuva, Swaha, and then you go up above, you know, Mahar, and then you go to Jana and Tapas and Satyam. And below you have the Patalas. Now the Patalas mean under the feet. And in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, you have 6 worlds, and these 6 worlds are under the earth. So here again, you have a very similar classification between upper heavens and lower dwellings. And there are beings who inhabit all these different planes. Now here you are talking about something which is not geographic in the material sense, geophysical sense, you are talking about something which entails rates of vibration. Therefore, different space-times and worlds which are subtler than ours and which cannot be really explored without acquiring higher perceptions through tapas and yoga. And here, whereas you see that while the earth below, I mean the patalas, are seen to be very beautiful and lavish and full of jewels and inhabited by nagas and other creatures, then of course if you go beyond the actual patala, which is seventh lowest, then you get to Naraka, which is the hell. And Naraka is very much present in all, I would say, not only in the so-called Indo-European traditions, but also in the Judeo-Christian traditions. So here again, you see something which is not restricted at all to the Indian subcontinent, but which is pretty much known all over the world. And that's, of course, the questions which modern scholarship has no answer. How could so many people all over the world come to similar conclusions and similar knowledge about things that modern science considers completely inexistent? There is something there that is, the progressive view which has been adopted in the West and then all over the world since the 18th century is that we are progressing. Therefore, all these people were ignorant. And now we know because we have a scientific method. Therefore, we dismiss most of what they said. We say it's mythology. And by the way, mythology didn't have that meaning. It meant a higher truth, if you read Plato. Whereas today, mythology is seen basically as an invention. And yet, we have no answer as to why these inventions, so-called inventions, were so commonly known and accepted, and why they were so concordant, how there was very little difference between the accounts that were given. So the question of saying it doesn't exist is I think, a very facile way of eliminating the problem. And in a few days, I will be speaking here on some of what modern science is now telling us. Not yet science, because science tends to run behind, or rather slow down things, I'm afraid to say. But what current discoveries are, and if you recently, you could have seen some of the testimonies given in the US Congress on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and you would have seen that now a number of authorities, both military and civilian, are coming to the conclusion that we have ignored deliberately a lot of things which happen to be there, including spacecraft, beings from outside our world who are far more advanced than we are. And that is now becoming accepted, even though there is a lot of fight back from a number of scientists who are, of course, very unhappy about having been in the dark about it, or who made a very big showing for many years of telling people, no, it's not true, just don't listen to it. We know what is true, and you have to listen to us. That is, of course, changing, where science has become a new religion, which is collapsing like many old religions. And it's not collapsing as science in general, but it is collapsing in the theories that it has propagated for a couple of 100 years. Now, this leads me to another very interesting question, which is the question of yugas and the question of varshas. Because as we all know, not only in India, but in much of the world, we are talking about 5 ages, a cycle of 5 ages. And in India in particular, we have these 5 ages, which are essentially of decreasing length, and which are reflected in the famous Pythagorean triangle, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is essentially from Satya Yuga to Treta, Dwapara, and Kali. And now there have been these debates. I'm not going to get into that because astronomers and astrologers, Jyotishis and others are much better placed to discuss it. But as you know, there is a discussion as to why, in some cases, you are talking about, let's say, an average length of 12,000 years for a yuga, which is the original, perhaps, or at least one of the classical understandings. And on the other, you are told about, of course, the Brahma Varshas, the divine year, which, of course, makes the cycle much, much larger. And if you're looking at the 12,000 year, which is a precession of equinoxes, approximately, I'm only talking of orders of magnitude here, then you would know that the Satya Yuga of our Yuga would be about 4,800 years long. and it would therefore have ended, I'll let you do the calculation, since Kali Yuga is supposed to have begun 3102 or 101 BCE. Now, that's of course a bit of a problem, because if that were the case, then Kali Yuga should have ended a long time ago and we should be back in Satya Yuga. And that doesn't seem to be the case. I don't know about you, but I haven't felt we're in Satya Yuga for a long time. So the question is then, are we more likely to accept within cycles, cycles within cycles, then it would make more sense to think of the Brahmavarsha. And in that case, let's put it this way, the Satya Yuga would have begun about 4 million years ago, and it would have ended a little less than 2 million years ago. Now, that seems absurd in the light, again, of, science, because they would say, well, there was nothing, a few million years ago, there were only some animals, but there was no human existence. But that, again, is a highly questionable, and perhaps I would say in some way, a highly dismissible version. Why? Because since we thought that the world was created 4,000 years BCE, and then we had to change that because we realized it wasn't matching. Then we began to say, all right, well, it must be, how old is Homo sapiens? And we began to give dates, and it was 100,000, and now we are talking about possibly 500,000 years of Homo sapiens existence. And frankly, I'm quite expecting for this date to be pushed back considerably. There was Narmada Man, which is supposed to have been 1 million years old. And now we try to say, well, but those people were very primitive, they were like apes. And that's, again, not at all proven. So even if you give a particularly, I would say, short span of time to Homo sapiens, you certainly would be free to accept the fact that there were other species that were as good, or if not more developed than Homo sapiens, and which were wiped out by any kind of catastrophes as we know have happened and happen every now and then. So that would tell us that the whole concept of archaeology beginning, I would say, a few thousand years ago, and then civilization as we know it, as we understand it, to be about 5,000 years old, which, by the way, is the time when Kali Yuga would begin, which is an interesting coincidence, if it is a coincidence. Then now you know that, for example, Gobekli Tepe in what is now Turkey is at least 12,000 years old. And now Gobekli Tepe is known to be one of several very major monumental settlements which are being discovered. That indicates that that whole land of what is now northern Syria, northern Iraq, Iran, and eastern Turkey was actually, it was the land that was called Haran, and Abraham in the Bible is supposed to have come from Haran, which is why he had all this wisdom. And Haran may have been, or should have been, in fact, was the seat of a very advanced civilization, which is at least 15,000 years old. Now, that gets rid of our concept that somehow humans were highly primitive until about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. It doesn't hold anymore. But then, if it is in one place in the world, there is no reason to think it was only in that one place in the world, because our whole concept of the creation of humanity begins with the couple. There must have been a man and a woman, and they had children, and then humanity expanded. But that, again, is biblical. Of course, it's symbolic if you take Manu. But then, of course, if you think of it, if it had started with one couple, the human species would have died out quickly because of inbreeding. After 5 or 6 generations of siblings marrying each other, you probably wouldn't have had a very good result. So definitely that's not really viable anymore. You have to think of groups, not just one group, but various groups of people. And I could go on quoting all sorts of controverted but valid presentations that have been made about, for example, Gunung Padang in Java being 25,000 years old and being a very major urban settlement. Now, again, you see cities and therefore kingdoms, states, existing tens of thousands of years ago. Now, that justifies the Puranas, it vindicates the Puranas, and it shows why all our concept of chronology as far as civilization is concerned has to be drastically reviewed. And it is, in fact, being reviewed. The problem is that it will take another decade, few decades, for many of our top so-called scientists, distinguished historians and scientists, to take notice of it. And that has been the case in every major paradigm shift in human history. If you look at Galileo, You realize that Copernicus before him, and then you go back to the ancient Greeks, and yet for hundreds of years, there was a status quo position that you are not changing this, the earth is flat, the sky is above, and God is sitting up there, and don't change anything. And then eventually they had to say, well, there is a solar system, and there seems to be something outside, so we'll call it the galaxy. And then they said, my goodness, there are more galaxies, and now with the James Webb Telescope, we know that there are trillions of galaxies and that the age of the universe is probably not what we thought it was until about 5 years ago. So you see, all these things are hypotheses which keep getting corrected all the time. And so I will end with a brief reference to the Devas, Asuras, and their, the places where they reside, the Vihartis. We already talked about them briefly. But that in itself, has been seen as just a figment of imagination or just some sort of symbolic presentation meant to give people an explanation for the natural forces, such as, the lightning, the storm, the sun, the moon. But if you look carefully, without prejudice, at the presentation, at the descriptions that are being made in the various texts that we are considering, you see that there was definitely a fairly precise classification of the beings who live in these various worlds. And again, when you talk Viharti, it's a very interesting term because you are talking about primarily a word, an expression. And a Viharti is also a loka. And if you look at the Greek, you are talking of loka, the analogous word is logos. And logos also has that meaning of being primarily the word, but it's also the spirit behind the word, because the word, the expression, the actual mantra, is a manifestation of the underlying non-material, spiritual fact, as it were. And therefore, loka, logos, viharti, is both a state of being, and it's also expressed as a word. And as we know, if there is no word, there is nothing. In a sense, things come into being when they are named, namarupa. So that tells us that there is a much deeper truth behind the existence, behind the description of the vihartis and of the lokas, the patalas. And it's, again, a very universal myth, since it's called that way, that at some point there was a great fight between different beings, the Devas and the Asuras were somehow pushed out and they were sent down under the earth where they still live. And that is where you see now the present dwellings of, among others, the Daityas and the Danavas. The Danavas, by the way, were very well known to the Greeks. So were the Daityas. They called them the Titans. And the Danavas were the Danaos. And even today, I mean, not today, but in ancient Greece, the Greeks called themselves Danaos. Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes is a well-known Latin adage, which means I fear the Greeks and those who bear gifts. And as a matter of fact, the connection of the Danaos with the Danavas is historically fairly clear. So are, for example, the Danites, the tribe of Danaan among the Hebrews. It's one of the 12 tribes, which had come from the sea and were probably the so-called Danavas. Now, the interesting thing is, therefore, and this is my conclusion, that you are talking about a hierarchy of beings, which even the Judeo-Christian cosmogony acknowledges, because it talks about the hierarchy of what it calls angels and the so-called princes. In Hebrew, the word angel did not exist. It came, in fact, from Sanskrit. It came from the name of some of the rishis, in particular the Angirasas. So that became angelos, angel, and angel. And so you can see that universal acceptance of the fact that there were certain beings that did not abide by certain rules, certain spiritual principles, and were pushed down into the lower earth, whereas those who essentially rejected them are still up and above us in all the heavens which stand between the earth and the outer universe. So that's what I wanted to illustrate in a way to show how there is what you might call a scientific contemporary interpretation to be given to the cosmogony that you find in the Vedas. And as we know, according to some traditions, in the Satya Yuga, there was only one Veda. And one of the earliest French scholars of India, Jacques Collot, he actually pointed out that he had heard from certain traditions that the original Veda and the oldest was Atharva Veda. And then eventually, before the Kali Yuga began, it was split into four. And that's how you had the four Vedas that we now know. So that's my essentially my brief attempt at throwing some light on where I think we're going in terms of our understanding of the Vedic tradition, and particularly the existence of Satya Yuga. Thank you.